Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this morning's webinar, People, Analytics, and Change, with Alec Levenson. Alec is a senior research scientist here at the Center for Effective Organizations at USC Marshall School of Business. So before we get started, I'd like to just go ahead and talk about a couple of housekeeping slides. So all of our listener lines are muted throughout the call. If you do want to speak, you can go ahead and hit the raise hand button on the side next to your name. You can also enter a question in the chat box. We prefer the chat box to the Q&A so that everybody can see it. So if you do have a question in the chat box, you can go ahead and mark all participants or everyone so that everyone can see your question. In order to pop up the chat box, go ahead and hit the blue chat icon at the bottom of your screen. You run your mouse over it, you'll be able to see it. If you click that button, it will pop up on the side. Click all participants, and then you can send your message there. We are recording this webinar, so a PDF of the slide deck and the recording of the webinar will be available afterwards. We will send that out to you via email within the next couple of days. So with that, I will pass it off to Alec.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you everyone for joining. So the topic for today is analytics and change, and I want to first set the stage by kind of bringing us up to date in terms of where things are with kind of the state of people analytics and organizations. The first point is that we do know now, there's no doubt that analytics has become very important. I'm sure it's the main reason why most of you have decided to join. These are just some examples of books that have come out recently. So you can always tell we're at the height of popularity when we've got lots of people piling in contributing books. We also know that data science is one of the hottest jobs that's out there. Here are just some latest quotes. There clearly is a huge demand. Now, when we're talking about data science and analytics here, this applies to not just people analytics, but analytics more broadly in organizations. But we're seeing this as well within people analytics groups where there's a very large demand for data scientists. The challenge that we have, though, is that data science and kind of analytics in general are not organization science. It's not business optimization and strategy analysis, and they also aren't systems diagnostics. And those three disciplines, three different ways of thinking about what's going on in organizations and how do we actually get to root causes are fundamental to the kinds of analysis that need to take place, but are not typically done within most people analytics groups. So I want to take you through a little bit of the history of what people analytics has been like, particularly from our vantage point here at the Center for Effective Organizations, and do it in one slide. So starting back in 2003, when soon after John Boudreau had joined the center, we were working with a number of our sponsor companies. In fact, it was at our annual meeting, and we were at the end of the meeting, and we're having an open conversation with people, asking, what kinds of hot topics they would like to see people addressed. And one of our sponsor members shot up their hand and said, what are you all doing in this whole, kind of HR metrics and analytics space? And it was a little bit of a strange question for us because as social scientists, it's what we do and it's what the center has done for its 40-plus year history. But the real kind of content behind that question was that this was the beginning of companies starting to say, hey, we really need to take a look at this analytics question. They called it HR analytics back then. People also call it talent analytics, workforce analytics, and now the most common name that we see around is people analytics. So what's happened since 2003 is that there's been a very large increase in organizations saying that they need to have analytics capability and building it internally. And people like John Boudreau, my colleague here at CEO, myself, and a number of other people at universities and think tanks across the world in consulting companies have done a lot in this space, in the past, almost 20 years. In 2015, I wrote a book that kind of summarized a number of the ways that we approach these issues here at the center, and I'll talk a little bit about that coming up. what I want to also emphasize, though, is that when we look at kind of where things were in 2003 versus where they were in 2015 and today, things have not necessarily changed a lot. So going back to 2003, for those of you who don't remember, so Cisco was renowned for its success at the time in particular. They also had a CEO, John Chambers, who had pledged, because of his experience at a previous company he was leading, he had pledged that he would never do a downsizing again as a leader. And this was before he came into CEO, and I'm sorry, before he came into Cisco. And before the drop-off, the big tech crash that happened in the 1999-2000. So what was interesting about Cisco is that they were a leading technology company, and they still are today in their parts of the business where they are. And they had built reporting systems so that they could close their books at the end of every day. They had almost perfect line of sight into what was taking place in terms of the actual financials of the company. And they had the same kind of leading capability when it came to reporting systems. So our sponsor contact at the time, the VP of HR, was fond of saying that she could ask for a new reporting feature to be written into their HRIS system, put the request in around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then it would be built by the next morning. And that's how good they were at building the capability in the systems to be able to do the HR reporting and get at the HR data. But yet, despite that transparency, they way overshot in terms of their expenses. Essentially, when sales started to slow down, they didn't slow down their hiring, and that led them having to do a huge write-down and big layoffs. So the lesson that comes out of that is that they had the best systems, and even today, if you look and you go to people analytics conferences and these meetups that people are now having all around the globe, people come together and they'll talk about how do we deal with data, how do we deal with data privacy in terms of GDPR, all kinds of issues about linkage analysis, data lakes, everything. Well, Cisco is a great case study that the systems themselves are not enough to be able to give you the insights, and yet people spend a lot of time worrying about them. My colleague, Max Blumberg, recently wrote a really great piece that talks about people doing 4 different roles in people analytics, and one of them is essentially focusing on the actual infrastructure, and it can be very easy to become obsessed with the infrastructure when we have to make sure we're actually focusing on the bigger picture questions. So the challenge is to make sure that we're always starting, not starting with the data, but starting with the business challenge. So how far have we actually come since 2003? Well, according to the report that Deloitte put out in 2017, and I know that these data would not look any different today because things do not change very fast over time. At the time, so today we have people who say that people analytics is a very high priority, but we get less than a third who rate it as being very important. Not only that, we have only 8% saying they have usable data, and 9% believing they have a good understanding of what talent dimensions drive performance in their organizations. They also spend most of their time focusing on pretty traditional areas of HR: recruiting, performance measurement, compensation, workforce planning, and retention. Now, the reasons for that are pretty straightforward. Okay. HR as a function and the HRIS systems, and for that matter, most of the accounting systems that we have around focus on people as something to be counted. Right? This is actually where the word accounting comes from. It comes from the day of counting. So, and we've trained our leaders to be thinking those terms as well. So we talk about headcount, we talk about FTEs, we talk about, even if we're outsourcing, there's still this question of how many people are we outsourcing, how many people are we hiring through vendors. With the gig economy now, we now talk about tasks, but that's still around, what are the actual numbers of tasks that are taking place. We don't talk so much about how we bring people together to function well in groups and teams. And that's actually one of the biggest challenges that we face within people analytics, and we have for quite some time. On top of that, there's also way too much emphasis on quantitative data, meaning the data is already at hand. So these are the challenges. They've been there for quite some time. Now, when we talk about more generally about what the challenges are that are out there, here's another report from McKinsey just a couple of years ago. And what they were focusing on was the ability of companies to really differentiate themselves with analytics. Now, in this case, McKinsey's they're not talking about people analytics. They're actually talking about business analytics, so the kind that you use to run your business. And even in that case, where we know that companies have spent enormous amounts of time, energy, and resources, making sure that they want to stay ahead of the pack in terms of having the ability to use analytics to understand about their customers, about their supply chains. What McKinsey found is that only 8% of companies using their methodology are actually breaking away from the pack, meaning that they're really taking leading roles here. And I really like these quotes that come out of their study. So what they found is that the breakaway companies actually prioritize and then map the decisions that are going to drive the most value by being addressed with the right time data insights. Okay? They liken it to the business process reengineering wave that swept the corporate world in the 80s and 90s, and say that we're at we're seeing an evolution of the science of decision making. Now, this point, that it's an evolution of the science of decision making, is perhaps the most important thing that we have to keep in mind in the people analytics world. And the reason is because this is about how we use people analytics to actually directly impact senior leader decision making. So we talk a lot about insights. We talk a lot about how we can use data, use measurement to be able to give us more scientific database decision making around people. But the business starts with what are the business problems we're trying to solve, not necessarily how are we using people in the system. Finance will often go to people because they're worried about cost, but anytime we begin a business strategy discussion talking about cost, we're doomed to fail. Right? We're not going to actually be able to use that for competitive advantage, except in some cases where that you're actually lagging behind your competitors in terms of margins. So if there's a couple of other, hold on one second. Sorry about that. There's a couple of other points I wanted to pull out of the McKinsey study, which was called the secret to scaling analytics. And they actually have a very nice summary. There's kind of 3 main buckets of things to do, and then 3 drivers under each of them. So what they call driver number 6 is to create cross-functional, collaborative, agile teams, which include highly committed business representatives. This is a really important point because there is a lot of, we know that we have silos in organizations, but even on the business side, there is, we create these groups that are around, that are design groups or, design thinking groups, digital groups. When we create a dedicated analytics group on the business side, McKinsey was already seeing that we're getting a lot of siloed behavior and getting a lot of those groups building really fancy systems and getting to some really cool data insights, but doing it in a siloed way and not actually building the cross-functional collaborative teams that you need to be able to actually apply the insights and engage with the data. And that's a really important concern for people analytics. I mentioned the 3 buckets, so they call it the categories here. So their third category, which has a bunch of drivers underneath it, is that they say it's really important to embed analytics into decision-making and processes to overcome the biggest challenges to any organization's journey, including turning insights into outcomes. Right? This point about turning insights into outcomes is a really key one because we talk a lot about data-based insights, and the biggest challenge is that oftentimes the people analytics group will sit there and they'll do really, really good work, and they'll come up with some really cool insights and then turn it over to the business, but then it doesn't actually turn into outcomes. And that's the challenge that we're seeing. So one part of the answer, this goes back to our history of people analytics in one slide, going back to 2015, is to make sure that we start with the actual business strategy and the business results to be achieved. So for those of you who have heard me talk before or seen my book, this is one of the 2 kind of key takeaways from it, which is that in people analytics, we tend to be down in the bottom, what I call step 3 here, which is the human capital analytics. And we tend to go straight to that, kind of looking at what's going on with the people in our organization. If you recall back when we were talking a little bit earlier about what Deloitte found in their study, when we're looking at recruitment, looking at performance measurement, looking at, all those things that come out of our HR processes, they're about differentiating one person against another. And in fact, if you go and you look at the kinds of case studies that people are presenting at conferences and at these meetups all around the world, there's a really big emphasis on how can we actually take the people data that we have to differentiate, say, who are the top performers, how does talent contribute, things like that. But that puts us in the bottom of this three-step process, which is that it immediately goes to the human capital analytics without first saying, what is it that's actually driving our competitive advantage? Right? So this is, if you're thinking like a C-suite leader, then you start with what is the businesses that we're in, what is it that we're trying to do in terms of win, and then you go down to where is it that in terms of the end-to-end business processes, things are working well and where they're not. And there's a huge amount of analytics to be done there, including a lot at the team level, at the group level, but yet within people analytics, we tend to go right down to looking at the individual level and ignore the teams. So that's one of the key takeaways that I had from my book. By the time I published the book in 2015, I had already been giving this talk around the world in many cases, and it's very nice to see that this has become pretty much a mantra. I mean, I'm not the only one who said that you should focus on the business, business questions at hand, but it's become pretty much standard now. People will say, oh yes, we have to make sure we're focusing on business questions. But what that amounts to within people analytics is they then say, oh, well, we have to show an ROI. We have to be able to show an impact of what we're doing. But showing an impact of what you're doing can happen by focusing on cost. It can happen by saying, well, we're saving money by making things more efficient, or we can fill spaces in our recruiting process much more quickly. Showing that kind of a business impact in terms of a financial ROI is not the same thing as actually making sure you're addressing the really big picture business questions. And this is an area where the people analytics functions, even in advanced organizations, tend to struggle today. And let me show you what I mean by that. So here's a summary. And essentially, the challenge is that, if you look in the middle here, that it's much easier to analyze these HR-focused topics of recruiting, performance measurement, compensation, workforce planning, and retention, because that's the data that's sitting there. And if we can find, if we can find the quote-unquote low performers, and we can help to either improve their performance or get them out of the system, then that should improve the business performance. And there's nothing wrong with that as a strategy for how we approach analytics, but it actually isn't the best way to be able to orient the work that you do within people analytics to be able to get the right outcomes. Okay. Sorry, I was looking at the chat box. There's a question there, Regina, which if you could address, I'd appreciate it because I'm not quite sure how to answer it. Okay, now what I want to now turn to is to show you some case studies from really advanced people analytics applications that help to prove this point that even today, among some of the leading organizations where you know them all well, because these aren't great cases for the first two examples, I'm not going to actually name the companies they came from, but these are all ones that you'd recognize, including amongst the ones that get a lot of press around doing some really interesting work in people analytics. So case study number one is one around improving quality in manufacturing. This is a global integrated company where they do manufacturing but also do sales and distribution, and they're a global leader in their space. In this particular case, they had a really pressing problem with quality issues within their manufacturing operations, and they knew that they were actually losing out on millions of dollars of sales. This was a product where they were selling everything that came off the line, and what was holding them back is that they actually were having quality problems, so they couldn't actually improve production as fast as they needed to, and there was a lot of waste that was going on. Again, this is amongst an industry leader, so top-notch manufacturing processes, really good excellence in manufacturing, and yet they had challenges that they couldn't quite figure out why they were having these quality problems. This was something that there were business analytics teams and people from within OD, within the company, that were already deeply engaged in doing some diagnostics. However, they weren't really looking at the people side the way that the people analytics team knew that they probably should be. So a little bit late to the game, the people analytics group was invited to come in to see if they could contribute. But they were pigeonholed from the start. They were actually told, well, we've got the business numbers down. We've taken a look at what's happening on the business side, and we're making some progress there. Why don't you come up with some ideas that you can bring to the table and then show us what you can do using your data to be able to contribute? And that was one of the setting up that way, kind of coming to the table that way, actually set the group up for failure, because they were told essentially that we can't take an integrated approach. We can't have you be, really have a seat at the table to be able to have us think in a holistic way around what is it that we've looked at so far, and how is it that we can integrate your perspective in people analytics so we can get to better outcomes. And that was a showstopper. I mean, they actually spent quite a long time doing some analysis with their people data. They came up with some kind of marginally interesting insights that that pointed out that there probably were some things they could be looking at around absenteeism, around thinking about kind of differentiating how workers were performing. But ultimately, the people analytics group wasn't able to get any traction because in a manufacturing environment, it's team-based. Yeah, and there is nothing, and the vast majority of things that take place there aren't because one person performs better than another. It's because you get this, highly synchronized, almost like a symphony orchestra, with everybody working together in unison, so that at a team level, at a site level, everything is happening the way it does. When the business goes to do diagnostics around manufacturing performance, they almost never go down to the level of the individual worker. They're always looking at the team-based and kind of business process, the end-to-end view look of what's actually taking place with the manufacturing operations. And what limited the people analytics group here is that they weren't part of those conversations from the beginning. In fact, there was some really interesting diagnostic work that the people in OD had done along with the business leaders to go in and hold focus groups and do some really, really deep kind of diving kind of case study analysis around what were some of the potential challenges, and the people analytics team couldn't even get access to that data. Even if they had, because they weren't part of that process, there was money left sitting on the table that the organization didn't take advantage of because they didn't have the people analytics group there. That's case study number one. Second case comes from another global company. This one's also leader in their industry. Not manufacturing. This is one that's more on kind of the services side of the business world. In this case, the company's leaders had gone way down the path of organizational agility. They'd read what the leading consulting companies were marketing around this and decided that it was something they really wanted to do. And they went and took organizational agility processes and rolled them across the whole organization. If we had more time, I could give a critique of concerns around how that work has been done. We've addressed that in other kind of separate work here at CEO around the difference between doing agile processes, which is a lot of what's being pushed right now, versus actual building organizational agility, which my colleague Chris Worley and Ed Lawler have done a lot of work around. But we can leave that topic for another time. Let's just say in this case that there was really good PR that the company was getting around organizational agility, but the internal look from the people analytics group and from others was that it looked like it really wasn't having the kinds of impact internally that they were saying it did externally. What they could see is that there were pockets where people are reporting that agility was making a big difference, but it seemed like those are more the exception than the rule, and that for the most part it really wasn't having much of an impact. But because the senior leaders of the firm had already committed to this, and they were publicly, kind of partnering with big consulting companies to say, see all the great work we're doing, It was a little bit of a taboo subject to say, well, what can we do to actually get to deeper impacts around agility? The analytics group actually came up with some really good things to test, focused not just at the individual level, but also at the team level. You can see the list here in terms of how leaders were using processes, what were the characteristics of groups that made them, better or worse fits for doing Agile, and then other kinds of things that could be going on. So there actually were they came up with a really good methodology, but ultimately they weren't able to get any traction because they were never able to get the group's senior leadership to engage. And the main reason for that is because the people analytics group had no reputation for being able to actually engage in helping with those really big picture business questions. They were thought of as much more, well, you can help us get some insights with HR data, but we'd never want to use HR data to be able to improve our organizational agility performance. Okay, let me just double check here, see Q&A. Okay. So, third case study. Now, I've given you two kind of cases where things are not, things weren't going extremely well, but here's one where the results were quite good. Okay. So, and this comes into the category of organizational network analysis. Our colleague and friend, Michael Arena, who is now at Amazon Web Services, but at the time when he was a GM, many of you may already be familiar with his book and his work. The book is called Adaptive Space, and it's about more than just his work at GM. It's a very comprehensive study of how to use organizational network analysis to be able to understand what is actually going on with organizational agility. Now, a key thing about this case study, though, and I'm calling his whole book a case study, is that what he and his colleagues did is to use organizational network analysis in the service of understanding organizational agility. So they had some very specific questions around what enables people to be able to collaborate and become more agile in their collaboration. And an organizational network analysis was a key tool that enabled them to be able to do that. Now, if you look at how O&A is being sold and being pulled into organizations right now, particularly where it's being billed and you can come in and you can do things like look at the digital exhaust. So look at how people are collaborating across email, other ways in terms of electronic communication within the organization. There is a lot of people pushing for, we should apply O&A because they can help give us insights into kind of how the organization works. Well, that is a lot of what essentially amounts to data mining. To say we should be using O&A to be able to kind of learn more about the business. Well, there's a long history within the social sciences and and analytics and business where just doing data mining by itself, if you're not being led by what are the hypotheses we're trying to test and what's the key business issues we're trying to solve. If you don't lead with those right questions, you can go down lots of dead ends and rabbit holes. In Michael's case, he did a great job of using it, though, for this bigger question around organizational agility and use it to learn about it, but didn't just stop at the learning. The most important thing, and this comes out of one of the case studies that he himself helped lead, is that you can use something like O&A to be able to actually then design interventions that are going to improve how people are collaborating. And that's actually where the real power of the research came from, and the power of the examples that they were able to show is that they used the analytics, the O&A, not just to shed insights into how things were happening, but also to then drive change within the organization. And they were able to do that because they approached it from an integrated organization development and analytics perspective. Apologies for my throat. They used an integrated organization development and analytics approach that embedded the O&A within this larger question about how do we actually improve the end-to-end processes of collaboration in the organization. And that's what I want to build on for the rest of the time that we're going to be talking here. So, and I'm going to set this up as a little bit of a contest. Wait, I see a question here. How might other survey input like engagement, culture, or satisfaction surveys become part of O&A? That's from Dawn. Thank you, Dawn, for that question. I want to let me answer it for a minute, but then hold off and then maybe come back at the end. I don't like to lead with a question of how do we add these other things into organizational network analysis, because that's leading with a technique as opposed to leading with what's the actual questions we're trying to solve. So when you talk about survey inputs like engagement surveys, culture surveys, satisfaction surveys, I view those and organizational network analysis as being, those are all tools that we can use to answer questions that are important for us to be able to actually drive, to create insights they can use to drive change. So the answer would be, depending on what question you're trying to solve, you may need to go to surveys and to ONA to be able to give you the right insights. But we can only know that if we start with the question we're trying to solve, look for what information is needed, and that'll tell us then, do we use existing surveys, do we use ONA, do we go out and collect new data? Or, as I'm going to argue here, do we think about applying organization development processes that might be quite a bit different than what we usually do with analytics? So when I mention analytics versus OD, if I had you all in a room, I could have you raise your hand right now. If I asked you to think about, do you think of yourself as being someone who's more like, aligned with analytics or more aligned with OD, most people can answer that question fairly easily because we've come to think of this as being kind of a left brain, right brain approach. So we've got analytics, which is more about logic. We've got OD, which is more kind of the people side of things, the emotional, how we all get along with each other. And these are very, very kind of deeply held stereotypes that we have about these two different groups. We've prejudged, and we think that analytics is all around competencies, around data analysis, statistics, and logic, dealing with situations where there's low ambiguity. And OD is much more roll up your sleeves, just dive into kind of thinking it, where are people in the organization, kind of where are they at in terms of how they're thinking about things. The data might say one thing, but they might be, reacting a different way. And how do you actually understand the psychology of how people are interacting with the data, interacting with each other, and what leads to the interpersonal dynamics and group dynamics? So those two descriptions of what it means to be in analytics versus what it means to be in OD is very common. I mean, like this, any of you probably could have done that without me, leading. Now, what I want to propose, though, is that despite the fact that it seems like they're almost polar opposites in terms of how analytics and OD approach their work, the principles underlying analytics and OD are quite similar. And if we run the processes of analytics and OD according to what I call an ideal end-to-end, then we actually would see that they look much more similar. So what do I mean by that? Here is an example, and by the way, a lot of what I'm going to cover right now is in a blog that I have up, and we'll give you the link at the end, so you can go so in addition to distributing the slides, you can also go and take a look at the article I published recently. So this first part of the table I'm putting up here, calling an analytics process. I have my colleague Alexis Fink to thank for this. This is something that she's used for quite a long time, and I actually find it resembles very much so how I approach doing the analytics work myself when I'm working with companies, but I always like to give her credit. So you can each read through it. I'm not going to go through it myself. Sorry, I see a chat question here. Okay, there was I'll answer this chat question after we're done with this slide. Okay. All right. So this is an example of an analytics process. Now, this is analytics processes done the right way. When in fact, a lot of people working with analytics groups don't necessarily do the whole 7-step process here. But this actually relates to kind of where it is that analytics tends to fall short versus OD. So let me put up an example of an OD process right next to it. Now, I did do some cherry picking here. So there are, if you go out and you look for kind of common, 7-step, 6 or 7-step OD processes. There's a lot of them that are out there, and I'll show you another one in a minute. But this is one that I purposely chose because it is very similar to an analytics process. Right? So, both of them start with doing some kind of diagnosis. They both involve data collection, feedback, and then doing something at the end in terms of evaluation. Now, the OD process does have a lot more in there because it actually talks about intervention and team building. The analytics side talks about taking action based on the insights, but is not really explicit about, really designing an organizational intervention and thinking about how it's going to impact the teams that you're working with. But, to start with, if I were to just say, if I were introducing kind of analytics versus OD to, somebody who had never worked in companies before, and they were to take a look at this, they'd say, they look pretty similar. Now I'm going to put up another OD process, and this one, the one on the right here, what I'm calling OD process number 2, much more closely resembles the way people think about OD. They actually don't tend to think about OD in terms of what I put in there as a OD process number 1. The idea around doing data collection, data feedback, it's actually a core part of organizational development. So in Chris Worley and Tom Cummings' textbook on organizational development, which is standard used around the world to train people in OD programs, they actually talk about action research. And action research is the part of the change process where you actually do that data collection, analysis, and feedback to make sure you really understand what's going on. But if you look at the kinds of case studies that get published around OD work and change work, and I've actually talked to Chris about this. I said, you and Tom have your book, and this is used to train people all over the world, but why is it that we don't see people doing actual action research approaches within OD? And the answer is that people get so wrapped up in the change process and the difficulty of engaging stakeholders and moving people through change that they never take the time to actually do the measurements. And that's actually part of the challenge that we have in terms of how we can get to better analytics and better analytics application. Part of the answer is actually improving the process of OD as well. That's a topic we can take up another time. So just in case, for those of you who are wondering, I'm here today talking about how we can use parts of OD to come in and make analytics be more effective. The same applies in reverse. So there's a lot around kind of analytics process that is supposed to be part of OD, but which doesn't happen the way that it should. And so we could also improve the practice of OD by being more thoughtful and more methodical around data collection analysis as well. So this is reflected in the OD process number 2 on the right, and in particular, the first 4 steps, which is org diagnosis, identification of alternative strategies, development of the change strategy, and implementation of the strategy. Those 4 steps are what actually amounts to the way that OD is done for the most part, how change is done for the most part. And if you look here with kind of the analytics process on the left and OD process number 2 on the right highlighted, this kind of highlights the divide between the 2 different groups. Okay. Now, before I go on to the next slide, I want to answer the question from Solange. So what year was this work done? Do you think senior leadership would have the same mindset today? I assume you're talking about the McKinsey and the Deloitte studies. Those surveys were done actually in real time, so they were done in like 2017, 2018. And senior leadership, yes, I absolutely believe that senior leadership would have the exact same questions today. So just as applicable. I see there's someone else typing. Okay, hold on. So, Maram, if you could actually retype your question, I'd appreciate it because I'm not quite sure what you mean. You say, can you please elaborate on your last point regarding the 2 points being different between them? Need a little more information, please. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. I want to be mindful of time. Okay, so yeah, so there's the four steps of OD really highlighted. Okay. Now, what we have today is that analytics and OD work are for the most part done in silos, and it's not optimal. And we know this about any end-to-end business process, is that in order to things happen smoothly, we have to be able to have really smooth handoffs from one part to another. If we take, so I just showed to you in the previous slides, different analytics and OD processes. Here I've combined them together into a single end-to-end process for how we could do diagnosis, analysis, action, and then evaluation. Okay, so here's the question again. Okay, so the question was on point number 2 in the analytics and OD process, you mentioned this is where OD and analytics differ. Could you elaborate on that? So the point, Maram, is that OD tends to focus a lot more on just doing the change and not actually doing measurements of going into data. Analytics tends to jump into data and not think about the change process. And so what we end up with is that the people in the OD world are very strong on change and how you engage senior leaders in change and how you actually follow through. So if you give people some information, some diagnostic information, and you say, how is it that we should be to leverage this information to make decisions about change and then implement it, OD is really good at doing that. Now, what they tend to fall short on is not actually digging into the data and doing new analysis and figuring out, is there additional analysis that should be done? That's the strength of where the analytics is today, is what kinds of analysis should we be doing, what kinds of new insights can we bring in, but then not knowing how to actually use that information to engage with the key stakeholders. This gets back to those 2 case studies that I was talking about where you had very deep analytic expertise within these people analytics groups, and yet they didn't have the expertise to actually engage with the senior leaders, so they're part of this larger brainstorming and diagnostic processes that take place when the business leaders are trying to understand what's going on with their manufacturing operations, or why is it that this agile processes are not having the impact that they want them to. So the idea is that we need to be able to bring the strengths of OD into analytics and vice versa so we can actually get to the kind of rigorous end-to-end process that you're seeing here. So I'm not going to read through the different points here. This is actually, these same points just summarize what was in the different OD and analytics processes, and you will get a copy of the slides. What I do want to do, though, is take you on kind of a little bit of breaking this down around where is it that people within OD and analytics focus their time and energy. So we've got the 4 steps here is the org diagnosis, analysis, action, and evaluation. That's the full end-to-end process that both people in analytics and people in OD should be doing. Now, when it comes to diagnosis, both OD and analytics do a lot with diagnosis, but they tend to emphasize very different things. So on the OD side, their strengths are engaging stakeholders who can drive change. So they will always say, well, who are the key decision makers here? Who are the ones that own the business process? What is it that they're actually trying to accomplish in terms of their business objectives? And to make sure that anything that we might do in terms of change focuses on those overall business objectives. So if you go walk into a situation where you've got a team that's not working very well, you've got kind of alignment and culture issues across the organization, there's lots of things that can be fixed. There's always things that can be fixed in an organization. But the really good OD people will say, we know that there's, like hundreds of things we can focus on. We want to make sure that we really focus on the ones that are critical for what's holding the business back, and let's go solve those problems. So that's where they'll focus their diagnostics. The people analytics approach, they also know it's important to engage key stakeholders, and certainly people who own at least part of the process. And I'd say that, an important lesson that's been learned within the people analytics community over the past 15, 20 years is that you really do need to make sure you get, key decision makers involved. But there's a difference between getting the key decision maker involved and actually focusing on what is at the foundation, what are the business problems that are happening here. So this gets into the issue between kind of incremental insights, versus the kinds of insights we need to be able to actually improve business performance. And people analytics will too often say, well, if we can, find some way to be able to have, kind of incremental impact, that's good enough. Whereas the OD approach would be to say, we need to make sure we're actually focusing on the bigger picture questions, even if they're hard to measure. And then the other point, kind of reiterating what I said earlier, is that in the people analytics space, they tend to focus much more on differences in performance amongst people, not teams and groups, whereas in the OD space, they'll focus much more on group and team performance and models of kind of what drives organizational performance. There is a question from Michael. Is it recommended that you hire someone or people who can do both, integrate the OD and analytics functions, or something else? So the answer is I would recommend, so what we've had is that there still tends to be a lot of silos within organizations. So even where you've got really good OD groups and really good analytics groups, you'll tend to get a lot of building up of the capability across the two groups. And you see people, we are seeing more and more, particularly amongst the larger analytics groups, they'll hire people in with consulting skills, with the ability to work with the business, but they won't necessarily people come in with a strong kind of OD and change methodology. And so they can help the analytics groups to become more business relevant in terms of what they're focusing on, but not necessarily in terms of driving change and integrating into that, which I'll get to in a little bit. All right, so there's some of the biggest differences in terms of how the OD community versus the analytics community approaches diagnosis. When it comes to analysis, that's pretty much the domain of people analytics. Right? People in OD don't really spend their time there. In action, that's where it then goes back to being the OD groups. And so if you think about this again in terms of an integrated process where we start with org diagnosis, then to analysis, then to action, and then to evaluation, this is where we can see the silos. So you've got people in OD who are doing different kinds of analysis than the people, diagnostics, than the people who are in analytics. The only people who are doing any serious data analysis are in the people analytics groups, and the only people who are doing kind of serious taking action from the data are in OD. And we don't have, if we get back to the McKinsey report, right? McKinsey talked about having agile, collaborative teams that are working together in real time. There's a lot more kind of, handing things back and forth between analytics groups and OD groups and actually getting them working together seamlessly, because it's not the way they're set up, and it's also not the orientation of people in the two different groups. And when it comes to evaluation, we get very little post-action review from either the two communities, OD or analytics. So what does the ideal future state look like for analytics? Right. I'm going to go now, on the left here, there are 5 different areas that are kind of either things to focus on or issues that have to be addressed when doing the work. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the current analytics state versus what the ideal future state looks like. So starting with the org diagnosis in the strategic context, where people analytics today tends to focus its energy is, can I show a business impact when I'm doing my analysis? Is there a way to be able to show an ROI from the work that I'm doing, or from the, will the work that I'm doing help the organization to realize a positive ROI? And those are quite reasonable things to do. But where I want you to be thinking about going is instead, what are the most important business issues to be addressed, even if it's hard to measure ROI? I mean, this is one of the key messages, again, that comes out of my book and what other people have been also saying. Now, in terms of focusing the analysis, because we have people who are working with the existing systems that we have, the existing data that we have, and there's a very strong, compelling, argument for this. This gets back to the Cisco case, right? We've spent millions of dollars, in some cases, tens of millions, dollars, euros, pounds, yen, on building these really fancy data systems, and so there's a strong, there's kind of almost like, strong gravitational pull to make sure that we use those data and use those systems to look at insights. And the people that we hire into the people analytics groups with all the data scientists and focusing on data warehouses and data lakes, it pushes people towards, what can we do with those data, which is almost all about looking at people at the individual level. Instead, what we need to be thinking about is what needs to be addressed, even if we don't have data sitting there. And this really means things at the team level, the group level, thinking about dynamics across those, and about things like organizational culture and organizational alignment. Okay? The methods used to answer the questions. So within the analytics world right now, it's almost always around what are the kinds of quantitative approaches I can take. So the organizational network analysis is a really great example of this. ONA is a way of taking things that used to be hard to measure and then making them easier to measure. But it's still leading with a measurement. Right? It's really cool to think about, wow, there's ways to look at the informal organization, ways that people are collaborating, but what you can learn about people collaborating using ONA is just starting to scratch the surface in terms of what we need to know. So what we need to know about collaboration versus what we can measure, even using ONA, there's a huge gap there. And so where you want to be thinking about is not just what are the quantitative techniques we can use, including the new fancy ones that are coming out, but what is the right mix of quantitative and qualitative? Because at the end of the day, and this is where the real strengths of the OD come in, it's about being able to walk into a room, sit down doing brainstorming with a team, with a bunch of leaders and say, where is it that we're actually seeing the challenges in our organizational system? And they have a lot of information. And that information is data-based, but that data comes from their observations, from their experience. And there's an enormous amount of tacit knowledge that people have about how the work takes place in the organizational system that we can't turn into explicit measurement. So there isn't data that's sitting there to do. And so rather than just relying on the data, things that can be measured, you have to embrace going into the qualitative side. This also applies when we think about how you actually disseminate the insights. Right? So in a typical analytics process, we'll do our analysis and then give feedback back to whoever asked for it. Right? So key stakeholders will give a report, and if we're really good, we'll actually be engaging with them all along, doing sense making around what we're learning from the data and then adjusting. That amounts to really good practice within analytics. Well, it's not enough. You need to be thinking about how do you actually integrate the insights and feedback into a change process. And change processes start from the first day that you engage with a stakeholder. It starts with thinking about how is change going to take place, but yet that's not the orientation of how we do analytics for the most part today. And the final point here is around the degree of ambiguity. Within analytics, and this gets back to the kind of the logic framework, kind of the left brain, right brain mentality. There is, if you give anybody a choice who's working within the analytics space between let me go, work with something that's measurable, that I can actually be really clear about what I'm looking at and come up with a straightforward explanation based on the data, they'll almost always go there, as opposed to thinking about the things that are much harder to measure. So this idea about kind of the low ambiguity versus high ambiguity, there's a huge amount of ambiguity when it comes to dealing with interpersonal dynamics, dealing with, where do we get organizational alignment? If we're just having conversations with senior leaders or with some, key informed stakeholders, and they give us their, really strong opinions or informed opinions about, how they think things are going on, people who are trained in data scientists have been essentially, raised on the notion, it's almost like, raised from birth as a data scientist, that you should question what people say, and question anecdotal evidence, and yet doing these kind of systems diagnostics and going to the areas where things are hard to measure means you have to rely on that kind of qualitative work. And if you don't, you're never going to get the buy-in and the seat at the table that OD does with those senior leaders. So ultimately what it comes down to is that analytics needs to employ OD tools to do the following things. First is, the goal here is to become a trusted business partner on par with what high-quality organization development looks like. Okay? What that means is that you have to master the science of interpersonal dynamics and not just think about how we differentiate people at the individual level, like think about, high performers versus low performers. It means engaging senior leaders in how to address the big picture challenges. And there's a lot of uncertainty there. And part of the challenge is that when we think about kind of what we can use data to look at, data is always backwards looking. Data tells us about things that have already taken place in the past. It doesn't tell us about how things should happen in the future. And when we're sitting down trying to solve business challenges, it's almost like getting to doing some scenario planning around, well, what are the options that we could undertake? What's feasible for the organization? Where is it that people have energy to be able to think about making change? And then you go and look for the data that can actually help with that process. Okay? And that gets to the second point here, which is how do you actually help to drive change? And that means being able to do this and engage in those conversations before you go and see what data we have on hand. There's way too much of a tendency to say, well, let's just go see what we can learn from the data we have first, and then we'll come back and, and see what more should be done. And that's totally putting the cart before the horse. And that gets back to the third point here, which is about embracing ambiguity and incomplete data. Doing really good systems diagnostics means that you have to do more than just what can be measured using statistical techniques. This means using logic models. If you think about the work that the strategy consultants do, so McKinsey, BCG, Bain, all the big strategy consulting companies, they have very analytical people. I mean, they can do really, really fancy analytics. But ultimately, when they come in and they're doing their org diagnostics, what do? They come through and they actually do interviews with people. I mean, they'll collect organizational data, but they don't do a lot of crunching of the organizational data. And in fact, a lot of they'll do surveys of, asking people about how they spend their time. Those kinds of data actually are some of the least useful that they that they gather, even though they tend to base a lot of, recommendations off that kind of information. But their best work is done when they're actually kind of embracing the ambiguity around, what do people actually say around what's happening in the organization and how can we get things back differently? And that comes down to the final point about having essentially incomplete data, right? So there is, most of the time, what we need to know is not sitting in our data systems, and so we have to go out there and collect it, and we can't always do a rigorous survey. And in fact, even if we want to do a rigorous survey, the really good techniques require that you do interviews first to figure out what you want to focus your survey on. Right. So these are the key takeaways. I'm going to throw up one final slide here and then get to the questions. So I do want to invite you to join us next month in Dallas, hosted by PepsiCo, Frito-Lay. Maura Stevenson and I are going to be doing a masterclass on people analytics and change, where we're going to go really deep into these questions, including talking about turning data into C-suite decision-making, doing a lot more along the topic of this webinar around how do you actually integrate analytics and OD. We're going to go through a lot of different OD tools and frameworks and, and analytics approaches as well, and then address how you can integrate them to be able to get to deeper insights and action. And that also includes doing really good qualitative work mixed with quantitative. You got the link there at the bottom to the recent blog that I mentioned called Analytics and OD, Twins Separated at Birth, and a link there for the masterclass to join us. So now let me turn, if you have any other questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box. I've got one here from Bruce who asks, what needs to be addressed, even if hard? Stakeholder priorities, including life central issues, money, relationships, health, multidimensional ROI, agree or disagree? Great questions, Bruce. The answer is all of the above. I mean, this actually, I mean, I feel quite privileged in the over 2 decades of work that I've been doing here at the center. I came in as somebody who was much more like a traditional analyst. So my background is in economics. I came into this work only looking at quantitative data, which actually is part of the problem that we have with it. People make fun of economists because they like to tell big stories with small amounts of data. And one of the reason why I came over to work in this field of organizational behavior is because there's a lot more than can be learned by just looking at that measurable data. What I find has been quite interesting is that what we're seeing within the people analytics space is that people in HR and in organizations are almost like repeating the sins of the past of the economists, where they're building whole systems and people oriented around just using that data sitting in front of them. Well, that's why I got out of economics, out of being just a regular economist and come and work in organizational behavior. And what I've been privileged to learn from my colleagues at the center and from the people that we work with in organizations is the power of the psychology side of things. So yes, stakeholder priorities are really important. And there's stakeholder priorities in terms of how they see the business, because if you ask different business leaders, they've all got different things that they're responsible for. They don't always think in terms of end-to-end business process themselves. And so part of this is about understanding that whole organizational flow of how the work happens and, where barriers come up, because it happens often in kind of in the handoffs in the end-to-end business process. So you got those kinds of differences in terms of how stakeholders view things organizationally, but then to your point, there's also differences in terms of what they want themselves, right? So understanding, why somebody might be in a bad mood or why they're not willing to cooperate, it may have to do with the organization design, the work design. It may have to do with they're having a bad day or, or other challenges that get into the psychology of things. And so the power here is to be able to actually do both. It's really a both and. Another question here from Jamila. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. So have you presented at the Association for Training and Development Professional Membership Organization? Yes. So yes, I'm quite familiar with ATD. This type of work typically is not the kind that ATD focuses on. They like to tend to stay more in the training space. But I actually have partnered with ATD in the past. I wrote a white paper for them that they published quite a few years ago called, I think they published it as something else, but I have a blog that essentially says, talent is an organizational capability. The challenge that we have in the training world with ATD and organizations like that, and the community they speak to around learning and development, is that learning and development is treated as an individual level issue, right? So what can we do to improve individual competencies? In a separate set of work that I'm doing around for a new book that I'm developing with my colleague Johanna Hansengruber, who's a strategy professor from Europe, we're looking at the question of organizational capability. And in fact, that's going to be, the entire book is going to be focused on organizational capability. And because we tend to think too much about building individual competencies and not about building team capabilities and end-to-end business process capabilities. We talk about those business capabilities, right? We talk about innovation, we talk about customer service, we talk about quality, but then there's too much diving right down into, oh, well, what do we have to do with individual people, research scientists, software programmers, customer service representatives, salespeople, and not thinking about the capability, we have the ability of the team and the organizational level. And so there's a whole separate set of work that, I gave a workshop for the first time on this last fall called Optimizing the Operating Model. We'll be doing it again later on this year. So this idea of looking at kind of the entire system around both what's happening at the individual level, at the group level, business process, and enterprise is something, it's a theme that you'll see. It's in my book from 2015, but also, when we're talking about how do we integrate these works of analytics and OD. Question here about where to find the paper on the blog. If you just, so again, there's an actual, the link here on this slide is to the blog on my LinkedIn site. You can also just go to my profile and see it there, or you can, send me an email if you can't find it. We'll be able to show it to you. Separate here, okay, yeah, I'll follow up this separate question for me privately. Great, so we're at the end of our time, and thank you all for participating. I appreciate it, and we look forward to engaging with you. Hopefully you can join us at the workshop next month in Dallas, but if not, at a future event at CEO.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.